I'm Paul Reville. I'm from Harvard University Graduate School of Education, where I am not only a faculty member, but I am the founder and director of something called the Education Redesign Lab. The purpose of the Education Redesign Lab is really to introduce and advocate for a much broader conception of education reform than that we've engaged in over the past 20 to 30 years. In other words, we need to have a system of education and child development that assures that each and every child has a fair opportunity to be successful in our society. And heretofore, most of our focus has been on schools and on optimizing schools, on taking the model of the typical school, which is 6 hours a day, 180 days a year, 20% of a child's waking hours during their K-12 years, and assuming that if we get that right, then we will have a meritocracy in our society and talent and effort will rise to the top. But actually the data, the evidence suggests that that's not true. After 20 to 30 years of very vigorous, expensive education reform, efforts to try to optimize school, many of which were highly successful, for example, in my home state of Massachusetts, we still have deep, persistent achievement gaps that line up along the lines of race, ethnicity, disabilities, language learning status, and most especially line up along income lines. And so we have an iron law correlation still in the United States and in virtually all of the states between your socioeconomic status and your educational achievement and attainment, on average, not for any individual, but on average. We're setting about to take a more holistic view of what it takes to make young people successful, and to say that schools are necessary, but they're not sufficient to the task of preparing all young people to success. We need good schools, absolutely, and we as taxpayers spend a lot of money on schools, so we ought to improve them and we can do better, and we ought to engage in continuous improvement as we ask all organizations to do. But at the same time, given that most of a child's waking hours are spent outside of school, we need to attend to the supports and opportunities that enable children to come to school in the first place and be ready to learn and supply their best motivated effort when they get there. So at the lab, we do advocacy to describe this theory of what the challenge is, our theory of what you need to do about it. We do field work in communities like this one and others all around the country who are engaging in building the architecture of systems of support and opportunity to enable children to thrive in school. And finally, we do a lot of research work. We're a research university, and we look into what's working and what isn't working in a more holistic, integrated approach to educating and child development. We found people here who really cared about this idea, believed in this notion that we have to do more than just provide a quality school in order to prepare young people for success, and that a one-size-fits-all school system wasn't going to get the job done because our children aren't one size. There are many different sizes, they have many different challenges in their lives, challenges that they bring to school with them, so that if we just give everybody the same treatment in school, it's not going to be enough for some children, while for others it'll be more than enough. So we found people in Southern Illinois who already had a holistic conception of what it takes to prepare young people for success. And we, frankly, were very interested in having a rural site because most of our work is in urban communities, reflecting, I think, a bias in terms of education reform more generally, that we tend to look toward urban communities because a preponderance of low-income and disadvantaged youngsters live in urban areas, so we tend to focus on that. It's understandable, but it leaves out a big chunk of the population. Maybe 20% of our young people in the United States attend rural schools. So we wanted to see what this kind of collaborative impact work, calling on communities to work together, would look like in rural communities, which are so very different from our urban communities. So it's a learning site for us, as well as, a partner in the work that we're doing in depth with 8 other communities around the United States. An individual student success plan is a bit like a medical record in some senses, that it follows a child ideally. We've sort of posited an ideal design for a student success plan, and now many of our communities are experimenting with different variations on the theme. But ideally, you'd have a success plan that followed a child from birth all the way to employment and kept track of what's going on in this child's life, what sorts of needs does the child have, what sorts of assets does the child have, and how are we as adults in the community through the school system or through other agencies meeting those sets of needs. And so that adults would come together in collaboration with the student and the family to develop a portfolio for each child. And then once that diagnostic profile was developed and updated, adults would also simultaneously be committed to intervening and doing something about the gaps that were identified in the student's portfolio, so that if a student didn't have access to but needed early childhood education, then there'd be a way for those adults, and there'd be the resources and capacity to supply that. If a child needed after-school education or summer opportunities, that would be there. Same thing for mental health or dental care for that matter. So it's a way of personalizing and saying, we're going to meet every child where he or she is and give them what they need to be successful, not just in school, but in life more generally. And that's the responsibility of the adult community, the whole community, not just educators, not just schools. This is on the whole community. I mean, the general idea was this was a tool that expresses our belief in what it will take to have a truly 21st century system of education that will have to treat children individually. So if a child starts school, but they've heard 30 million to 50 million fewer words than another child has heard prior to kindergarten, which happens on a regular basis, then we're going to have an intervention and a design that compensates for that in some way and treats that child differently than the child who's heard those 50 million words and is already literacy ready and wants to go the next step. So we're going to have to look more like a medical system. And what we have now is a one-size-fits-all treatment. And equality is not the same thing as equity. And so we're aiming at having an equitable system. And we thought that through popularizing the notion of an individualized success plan, something that we already do to some degree in special education through individualized education plans, but they're more legal documents and framed and focused exclusively in schools. But if we broaden that concept and say every child deserves to have that kind of treatment as individuals, much as we would do in a medical system, we don't have everybody who enters the hospital get the same treatment and the same length of stay. We meet them where they are and give them what they need in order to get healthy. And that's what we're aiming to do through the individualized success plans. I haven't been here that long, but I've been watching from a distance, number one, so and in touch with the people who've been active in the field. People on my staff have been down here visiting, and so I've got a number of points of evidence to develop an opinion on. So number one, and just in what we saw this afternoon as we talked with the faculty members and leadership in the school district about their implementation of individualized success plans, you're seeing a very sophisticated look at what the role of educators in the 21st century needs to be, and that it needs to go beyond the conventional boundaries of what we've historically thought of as school and school focus. This isn't just about the 3 R's. The 3 R's are important, but students aren't going to be successful at learning the 3 R's, let alone 21st century skills at a world-class level, which is what we're asking schools to do now, unless they have the supports and opportunities necessary for them to come to school genuinely ready to learn. And so there seems to be, in all of our visits here, and I include my team in that, a pretty strong commitment around leaders in this community, educators in these communities, to taking a more holistic view of what it takes to get young people successful. And while you have a changing economy, and rural communities feel that as much as anybody in the United States, the changing nature of the economy and the shifting needs of the labor market and what it takes to get young people ready, there's a kind of receptivity to change and to working together that you don't necessarily find in other places around the country. So I've got a very favorable impression, particularly among how the educators have embraced the business of trauma-sensitive schools and being more responsive in a 360-degree way to the needs of children, so children can move by toxic stress that might exist in their life and concentrate on actually learning. And I think the challenge then is to broaden that set of contacts to the whole community, to take in the whole village into the challenge of raising young people who can be successful, participate in a 21st century democracy, a 21st century economy, support themselves and a family, and enjoy the benefits of middle-class life in America. I mean, that's what we want for our children. We want them to be gratified, fulfilled individuals, and at the same time be economically viable and be able to be good citizens. And so that's going to take more than just saying, through some sort of magic and at 20% of their time, let schools accomplish all of that by themselves. It's too much. So the whole community has to get engaged, and that's the challenge. And I like the steps and the progress that's being made in Southern Illinois toward bringing people together to address that challenge. I heard a lot today, and very encouragingly, about student agency and student voice. In other words, as we design 21st century systems of education and child development, we should be careful to design them in ways that are responsive to the needs of the people who they're going to serve. So in the design process, students and parents should be consulted. They shouldn't necessarily be the only people to be consulted, but we need to get everybody around the table. The public needs to be engaged in this. Taxpayers, citizens, people without children, to recognize that the future of their communities is going to depend on the preparedness of their young people to be successful. And for the young people to be prepared to be successful, it's going to take more than just a good school, and everybody's got to get engaged. So it's about leadership here. We really need leaders to emerge in communities like this, not just school superintendents and school principals and teacher leaders who are important, but leaders of the community, those who have stature and influence and can galvanize a community to see with some urgency that America will thrive in the future based on our capacity to develop human capital. And if we don't pay attention to how we're developing our young people, we're at risk of falling perilously behind. Because no one's going to pay Americans the kind of wages that we've been accustomed to that have supported a middle class in this country for a century now, to do work that machines can do or other people well-educated in other countries will do for a fraction of the price. So we're going to have to be highly educated in this country if we're going to compete. And we haven't built the systems yet to do that. We've worked hard over the past 25 years or so through various forms of education reform to bring our schools up to doing that. But it's been necessary yet not sufficient to meet that goal. So we've got to take another look. We've got to draw in the families. We've got to draw in the communities. We've got to work harder at giving children what they need inside and outside of school to be successful, much as those of us who have privilege do with our own children. And as we think about the future, the reason that we conceptualize our work in communities like Southern Illinois as working with laboratories around the country, we don't have the answers, so we don't come to you from Harvard with all the answers and a fat briefcase and a PowerPoint show. We come to say we're interested in co-constructing with communities this 21st century system of child development and education. And so as we shape our future work, we try and follow the principles that we prescribe for others, which is to say, what are the communities that we're working with tell us about what they need to get the job done? So recently, for example, we've published papers having to do with not just the individualized success plans that we were talking about today, but how to build a children's cabinet. That is, how to pull in the various folks in the community who have influence, grass tops as well as grassroots kinds of people, get people around the table in a children's cabinet designed to galvanize and focus the community on child success and child development. So that's something. Another thing that many of our communities have told us that they need resources, financial resources. They've exhausted their public budgets, and yet there's so much that needs to be done. There's so many gaps when they look at what children need and what the ideal system would be and how do they fill those gaps. no easy answers there, frankly, but we've just published a guide on how you raise, how some communities around the country have been able to raise additional resources through children's trust mechanisms and other vehicles to help fill those service gaps. So that's an important part of the work. So we're trying to listen to our communities and say, what are they running into that it's difficult? Something that we're focused on right at the moment is parental and family engagement, which I mentioned earlier, is how, okay, if we decide in our community that we want to do a better job of engaging parents and families and communities, taxpayers more generally, citizens more generally in our communities, what are ways of getting them involved in this work, and how do we build public will? Because while those of us in this room are sort of generally inclined toward this work, motivated and feeling that this is a mission in life for all of us, not everybody feels that way. And folks feel like, well, I'm already paying enough in taxes, and I didn't have these kinds of services and supports when I was younger, so why do we need them now? And so on and so forth. And we have to make the case. We have to make a value proposition to society that we have kind of a convergence of sort of our moral responsibilities with our practical needs for survival. And what I mean by that is we owe it to each generation, and we're in a time of declining social mobility. We owe it to each generation to give them every opportunity to realize their full potential and to be successful in society. That was, for the most part, what was done for each of us, and that's what we should do for the next generation of children, our children generally, not just our own particular children. Well, so that's one obligation, but even if you don't recognize the moral and ethical dimension of this, if you looked at it from a practical standpoint, how are we going to develop a prosperous economy if we don't develop the talent to drive that economy, and that talent isn't really superior to talent around the world? That's the only way we're going to compete. That's the only way we're going to grow business, the only way we're going to grow an economy, grow a tax base. And even if you didn't believe in the economic development aspect of it, if we fail to do that, we are going to build an even larger underclass than we already have of folks who will need to rely on the rest of us to provide for them because we haven't educated them and reared them in such a way that they can participate in that economy. So one way or another, if you see it as a moral obligation or you see it as a practical response to meeting our own needs as a society, we've got to do this work. This work is urgent, but again, not everybody believes it. So making the case for that in a convincing way is part of what we envision as the future work at the Redesign Lab. I think that really this is the most urgent work of our time for the reasons that I just described. That our future prosperity as a nation, our viability as a democracy depends on doing this work, depends on doing a better job of preparing all of our young people to be successful. If we fail to do that, we are a nation at risk. 30 years ago, 36 years ago, we had a report called The Nation at Risk that said in the late 20th century, if a foreign nation had done to ourselves what we had done to us, what we have done to ourselves in education, we consider it an act of war. That we're not really ready to compete in the 21st century. And we've tried, but so far we have not succeeded in meeting that challenge that was laid down by Nation at Risk. So in my view, we're still a nation at risk. And this kind of work, the kind of work that you're pioneering down here in Southern Illinois and is going on in many communities, not just the ones we work with, but many other communities, in bits and pieces and on islands throughout the country, needs to be knit together into systems of opportunity and support that make it possible for all children, not just those who've been born into the superior advantages of economic privilege and social capital, but children generally, regardless of the accident of birth. This is what America was supposed to be about, a meritocracy. Everybody has a fair shot. And it's not the case now. So we need to remedy that and figure out how to do it and what that architecture looks like. So this is urgent work.